This video is brought to you by Squarespace, the all-in-one platform where entrepreneurs can easily create and customize their own personal or professional website. More on Squarespace later in the video.
So hello and welcome to another episode of Biographics. I'm your host, Karl Smallwood. If you don't believe me, that's my real name. You see it on social media at the links below. And today we're talking about William Stephenson, the intrepid spymaster who inspired James Bond. And as with all the videos on our channel, this one is based on original articles submitted by our army of writers. This one being Radu Alexander. If you like the sound of that name, you can follow them on social media if they provided the links below. But let's get to it. When people ask what you do for a living, there are a few answers you could give that would sound more impressive than Spymaster. YouTube host doesn't really have the same gravitas, does it? But that was essentially what William Stephenson did during World War II, as he was absolutely instrumental in establishing the UK's intelligence network in North America and creating a tight-knit relationship between numerous different agencies from both sides of the Atlantic. And as if that wasn't good enough, he also had a badass codename: Intrepid. And sure, Stephenson was crucial to Britain's comeback success in the war, but it's the really cool title and nickname that we want to talk about today. In addition to all the other stuff that he did. To add to his many accolades, Stephenson is noted as being among the people to have served as an inspiration for the most famous fictional spy in the world, 007, because one of the many agents who worked alongside him was none other than Ian Fleming, who once wrote, "James Bond is a highly romanticised version of a true spy. The real thing is William Stephenson." But we're getting ahead of ourselves. William Samuel Stephenson was actually born William Samuel Clouston Stanger or Stanger. I looked up multiple pronunciation guides on this one, none of them seem quite clear on what the pronunciation of his last name is, in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada on January 11th or 23rd, 1897. Quite fitting for a spy, we don't know the exact date he was born. The records are a bit hazy for, around this time period, so forgive us for any details we get wrong. But just think of it as just, a bit of extra meta world building for a guy who would become known as the Spymaster of World War II. The second of four children to William and Sarah Stanger, a Scottish and Icelandic immigrant respectively, although their eldest died in infancy. William's time with his birth parents was depressingly brief. In 1901, his father died of progressive muscular atrophy, a condition exacerbated by a lifetime of grueling hard labour. His mother was left to raise three children on the pittance that she earned as a charwoman, or colloquialism for a cleaner. She turned to help from one of her friends, another Icelandic immigrant named Kristen Stephenson, who lived in a house in Point Douglas, alongside her husband, and this is her name, Vigfús, and their children, and she offered to take in William and raise him as one of their own. It's unclear what became of Sarah Stanger and her other children from that point on, but young William was adopted by Vigfús and Kristen and became known as William Stephenson. Life with the Stephensons was pleasant but not exactly easy. All of William's adoptive siblings had to find jobs to support the family, and eventually, so did he. He left school after finishing the 6th grade and began working in a lumber yard, later switching to a position as a telegram delivery boy. William was still with the Great Northwest Telegraph Company in 1914 when World War I started. 2 years later, he decided that he didn't want to just stand idly by as the rest of the world fought, so he enlisted with the 101st Battalion, Winnipeg Light Infantry, and got sent to a training camp. A few months later, he was headed for Britain aboard the SS Olympic, and from then on, to France. Unfortunately for Stephenson, his time in the trenches was not only short-lived, but he almost got him killed. Less than a week after arriving in France, he was wounded and gassed in combat. He survived, but had to be sent back to England for convalescence. Stephenson needed a whole year to get back on his feet, but he put that time to good use. He took courses at Exeter College on wireless communications, aeronautics, navigation, and internal combustion engines, which were a newfangled thing at the time. He got back into shape by canoeing and boxing. In regards to the latter, Stephenson had actually been quite passionate about pugilism for several years, but now had an opportunity to practice it competitively in the featherweight class, and even won a championship in the Inter-Allied Games. He also became good friends with another boxer, a burly American by the name of Gene Tunney, who would go on to become the world heavyweight champ. When it was time to get back to action, Stephenson wanted to become a pilot, so he joined the cadet wing of the Royal Flying Corps. By 1918, he was ready to return to France, this time as part of the RAF. Suffice to say that Stephenson excelled as a pilot. He became a flying ace and earned several medals, downing anywhere between 12 and 26 enemy aircraft, depending on who you ask. But you know the old saying, some days you're the windshield, other days you're the bug. Being a pilot during World War I was one of the most dangerous jobs in the world, and inevitably, someone else had Stephenson's number. In July 19, his plane got hit and went down in enemy territory. Stephenson survived the crash but was captured and sent to a prisoner of war camp in, and I hope I pronounced this word correctly, Holzminden. His time as a POW is poorly documented. Stephenson said that he and his fellow prisoners would while away the hours holding competitions to see who could steal the most stuff from German prison officers. He managed to escape the camp in October 1918, shortly before the war ended, and he would have been released anyway. By 1919, he was back living in Winnipeg. Now that the war was over, Stephenson needed to find a way to make a living. Eventually, he would become a rich and successful entrepreneur, but that success did not exactly happen overnight. His first venture was to open a hardware business called Franco-British Supplies. Clearly, creativity wasn't one of his strong suits, alongside a friend named Charles Wilfred Russell. Unfortunately, the two of them picked a pretty bad time to start a new company in Winnipeg, as there was a recession that culminated in a general strike. Nobody was looking to buy what Stephenson was selling, so just a year later, the company filed for bankruptcy. Now, there were almost 100 creditors all over North America looking to recoup some of their losses. Stephenson thought it wise to make himself scarce, so soon after the bankruptcy date in 1922, he packed his bag and moved to England. So this is the part of the video where we talk about our sponsor. And today's sponsor is Squarespace. And to help me work my way through this, I've got off-camera Brad and Nisha from FactFeed. And Brad and Nisha, what do you know about Squarespace?
It's an all-in-one website platform.
Of course, yeah, we've all heard that. But what is Squarespace really?
Well, it's a website where you can literally customize anything.
Yeah, but what does that mean?
You can customize anything you want, Karl. You can put anything on it,
but
anywhere,
But what does that mean?
Whether you're an amateur or a business person.
Nisha's she's just posting through it.
Just keep going through the read, it's fine.
Just posting.
Just let him have his fun.
No! But what does that mean?
Squarespace has this thing called a fluid engine.
See, that interests me, because I want to know how you name that. Because naming
mean?
things is so difficult. Yeah, what does fluid engine mean?
Basically, you can drag and drop anything anywhere on the website. There's like no limitations, like you would get on Word, for example.
I was being silly and facetious earlier, but this is a genuinely useful tool for people who want to create a website. It's like, if you want a website and you don't want to do all the ball ache stuff on the back end, this is the tool for you.
Like literally, there's been times where I've wanted to create websites and I just can't get the look right because of the limitations. Whereas with Squarespace, you could literally create anything, anyhow.
And you also, as well, to get to the point, think I'm really smart. You drag someone across and you go, you know what? I'm a website designer.
You do feel very impressive when you show a website. Like, do you make it yourself?
Yep.
Yes, I did.
Absolutely. And they don't see it. In the back of your head, you're like, thanks, Squarespace. The most valuable thing we all have, let's get a bit waxed, a bit philosophical here, it's time. Time is the most valuable thing, and anything that allows you to save time is going to be useful.
Well, what about money, Karl?
Well, of course, money is also important. If you want to make money, you can do that on Squarespace. You can have one-time payments or subscription services. You can sell your time. Prove the value of your own time. You can create courses, yes, that's the thing.
Yep.
You create your own courses on Squarespace. You can teach people. Teach people your skills. Share them with the world. And now, just speaking as a content creator, one of the tools that I think Squarespace genuinely deserves some praise for is just making analytics front and center of their advertising campaign. Analytics online are king. If you're not keeping track of them, you are not using the internet correctly. If you want to create content, you want to monetize your time, your hobbies, or just create a website that shares a passion or interest of yours, tracking who's viewing that, where from, and all that good stuff is an incredibly valuable and important thing, and Squarespace makes it very simple. So thank you to today's host, Squarespace. Check out www.squarespace.com/biographics for a 10% off on your first purchase of a website /domain using the code Biographics. Stephenson's first company was a great big flop, but it did not deter him. Somehow he arrived in England still flush with cash, and he was looking to invest. Ever since his days as a telegram delivery boy, Stephenson had developed an interest in radio and wireless technology. So he invested in the General Radio Company and Cox Cavendish Electrical Company Limited. And not only did Stephenson contribute funds, but he was something of a tinkerer in his own right. So despite having no formal education in electronics, he managed to patent a wireless photography system that was the precursor to the modern fax machine. In October 1923, Stephenson was the managing director at a radio company and even returned to Canada as its representative to showcase their products at various electronics exhibitions. This voyage was notable because on the return ship, Stephenson met a tobacco heiress from Springfield, Tennessee, named Mary French Simmons. The two fell in love and got married on July 22nd, 1924. Some have cast doubt over the true extent of Stephenson's personal involvement in his work related to the transmission of images, but assuming his claims are true, which this is a video about him, we're going to give him the benefit of the doubt on this one. His patent turned Stephenson into a multi-millionaire by the time he turned 30. His wife's fortune probably also didn't hurt either. Even so, he had no intention of slowing down, so over the following decade, Stephenson kept expanding and diversifying his business interests. He founded a holding company called British Pacific Trust that invested in a number of different industries such as aircraft manufacturing, steel production, cement, and real estate. Stephenson even got into the movie business at one point, helping form Sound City Films, later known as Shepperton Studios. Stephenson's business took him all over the globe, including, as mentioned, Canada, where he still owed money, making connections and meeting the top industrialists, inventors, engineers, politicians, and financiers that the world had to offer. It is unclear when exactly Stephenson first met Winston Churchill, but the British statesman and future Prime Minister would go on to rely heavily on William Stephenson's skills and expertise in the tough years that would follow. It was during these frequent trips to continental Europe that Stephenson also became acquainted with the perilous rise of Nazism. As a prominent businessman with his fingers in many pies, or I guess 10 pies, if this metaphor was taken to be literal, Stephenson met with a lot of important people and had access to a lot of sensitive information. It was only natural that he would make for an enticing target for British intelligence to approach, just to convince him to keep his ears open whenever he travelled abroad. And that's how William Stephenson became a spy. Although the exact year is a bit of a mystery, we are talking about espionage here, it could have been as early as 1936, but as you might expect, these people are pretty big on secrecy and not the kind to spy and tell, so we don't really know. Stephenson himself would approach the subject very loosely, saying in an interview, and I quote, "We were all friends, you see, Churchill and the rest. We were a group of friends who saw the war coming." By 1938, Stephenson had already become an invaluable, although unofficial asset, who was gathering intelligence and doing research into German rearmament on a large scale, something that was forbidden according to the Treaty of Versailles. Stephenson saw this as a major threat, believing that Britain was, to quote him, woefully unprepared for a war with Germany. And so did Churchill, although the latter had trouble convincing Parliament of this fact. Sure, we all know that hindsight is 2020, but Churchill's predecessor as Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, would forever be remembered and criticised for his foreign policy of appeasement when it came to Nazi Germany. There is a story from around this time, which is poorly documented even by espionage standards, and is most likely apocryphal, but we absolutely had to include it since it involves Stephenson volunteering to assassinate Hitler. So we have to emphasise the word allegedly here, but we're going to tell the story as it's recounted in admittedly very, very, let's put it diplomatically, hazy sources. So the story goes that in 1938, Stephenson was corresponding with his contacts back in Britain about suggestions for averting the impending calamity, as he wrote in his letters. Stephenson believed that the best course of action was for a lone English sniper to take out Hitler during a rally. Not only that, but he offered to be the one to do it and then disavow any connections to the British government and accept the consequences of his actions. However, the Foreign Secretary at the time, Lord Halifax, vetoed any such measures, believing that assassination should not be used, and I quote, as a substitute for diplomacy. Of course, we all know now that Stephenson's fears were wholly warranted and later proven unfortunately correct when Hitler started invading his neighbours. Once World War II was out in full force, Churchill became the new Prime Minister of the United Kingdom and began working closely with America, even though it would be a while before the US would officially enter the fray. President Roosevelt wanted help from British intelligences to collect information, and Churchill had just the guy in mind. So in spring of 1940, Stephenson packed his bags and went back to New York City. Stephenson's first contact with America was the director of the FBI at the time, J. Edgar Hoover. Allegedly, their introduction was made by his old boxing pal, heavyweight champ, Gene Tunney. Stephenson's main objective in America, though, was to set up the British Security Coordination, or BSC, a covert organisation whose goals were to look after British interests in the United States, counter German propaganda, protect their assets from sabotage, and generally just maintain a good public opinion that was pro-Britain and anti-Nazi. Hoover did want to get on board, but he refused to do so without a direct order from the White House, since it would be contravening America's neutrality laws. Neutrality with Nazis. Fortunately, he did receive word that President Roosevelt wanted the closest possible marriage between the FBI and British intelligence. And so it was that the BSC opened up its shop at the Rockefeller Center in Manhattan, although anyone who mistakenly wandered into the headquarters would find themselves not inside the headquarters of a spying organisation, but the British Passport Control Office, apparently not even realising that the people they were talking to about getting their passport renewed were spies on the government's payroll. At its height, the BSC had just shy of 1,000 members. It wasn't just spies, but also journalists and radio workers, who tried to minimise both Nazi sympathies and support for isolationism, which argued that the United States of America should stay out of the war. And then there were also plenty of officers and agents who kept open lines of communications with an ever-expanding network of contacts from other agencies. This included one Ian Fleming, who was working as a naval liaison officer when he met William Stephenson, and clearly saw in him qualities he thought would make for an interesting spy character. Roald Dahl, better known as the beloved children's author who would write Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and James and the Giant Peach, was also another member of Stevenson's Little Spies, or Intrepid as he was now known. Stevenson's first major score as the head of the BSC was helping to engineer the so-called Destroyers for Bases deal from September 1940 that saw Britain receive 50 destroyers from the United States without the latter breaking its neutrality laws. One of Stevenson's closest associates during this time in the BSC was Bill Donovan, an American lawyer and former soldier who would serve as the head of the Office of Strategic Services, or OSS, the precursor to the CIA. Stevenson arranged for Donovan to take an extended trip to England to see the situation for himself. This was done through secret channels, and not even the American embassy in London knew about it. This was probably for the best, since the American ambassador Joseph Kennedy, the father of JFK, was convinced that Britain's defeat was inevitable and kept advising Washington to not get involved. Cheers for that one, Kennedy. Donovan needed to see how things stood. After all, as much as he wanted to help the UK, he would advise against it if he thought that American assets would simply be destroyed, or even worse, captured by the Germans and used against them. After a few weeks in England, Donovan returned home, convinced that the British desperately needed American help and that they should provide it. Donovan got FDR on board, but the president was still shackled by the limitations of America's Neutrality Act, not to mention that he had elections coming up and didn't want to seem too pro-war, even if that was pro-war with the Nazis. Eventually, after enough legal finagles and loopholes, the deal was done. FDR got senior military officials to certify that 50 agent destroyers were not essential to the defense of the United States. And instead of simply providing aid, America made a trade in exchange for a 99-year lease on British naval and air bases. And Roosevelt pulled it off without the need for congressional approval. Of course, he still got a lot of flack from his political opponents for doing this, but overall, it was a crucial deal that did help turn the tide of the war. It represented only the beginning of the Anglo-American cooperation that was to follow. When he wasn't securing military assets, William Stephenson was looking after Britain's image in America. As we said, there were plenty of interest groups who promoted isolationist views, feeling that this wasn't America's war. And then, of course, there were others who were just openly in favour of Nazi Germany. So Stephenson had BSC agents infiltrate these groups all over the country to keep tabs on who was doing what. At the same time, he was making powerful allies in the media. The New York Times, the New York Post, the New York Herald Tribune, and the Baltimore Sun were all sympathetic to the British cause, or at the very least, not big fans of Nazism. At one point, the BSC even subsidised a radio station in New York called WRUL and turned it into a non-stop propaganda and recruitment channel. Of course, all the propaganda work became decidedly less necessary after the United States officially joined the war in December 1941. Once that happened, Stephenson could redirect his attention elsewhere and started opening a spy school in Canada on the shores of Lake Ontario. Unofficially known by the frankly awesome moniker of Camp X, this was the place during the war where American and Canadian agents trained to do super secret spy shit like espionage, sabotage, unarmed combat, weapons training, and even silent assassinations. It's worth noting that the agents who trained here were not protected by the Geneva Convention due to their antics, and many of them were captured, tortured, and indeed executed by the enemy, while those who survived received no individual recognition for their efforts. In addition to this, the camp had an advanced secret communications network that they called Hydra. Seriously, which the Canadians kept using until the late 60s during the Cold War. Not particularly relevant, but we thought it sounded cool, which it does, to find out, Spies used a communication network called Hydra during the war. That's pretty rad. Nowadays, what's left of Camp X is a park called Intrepid Park, in honour of Stephenson's codename during the war. You might notice at this point, other than Stephenson's early years as a pilot with the RAF, most of his work was done at his desk or in meetings, not quite as many perilous encounters with evil villains in secret lairs fighting off deadly henchmen with sharp bowler hats as one might expect from a super spy. Certainly not a super spy who inspired James Bond. Certainly no drinking shaken martinis with sexy ladies with the suggestive names like Pussy Galore or Plenty O'Toole. But the reality is that we simply don't know the true extent of Intrepid's goings-on, and we probably never will. He certainly travelled a lot, and it's not like he had a 9-to-5 office job. During the war, he made over 40 trips to Britain alone. But most of them were confidential and undocumented, made using aliases because, spy. After the war, most of the BSC records were destroyed, and the people who used to work there know how to keep a secret, again, because spy. So his activities still, and likely will forever remain, a mystery. What we can offer, though, is a quick description courtesy of the head of the UK Special Operations Executive, Colin Gubbins, who considered Stephenson's actions a series of brilliant individual coups against Axis powers in the true traditions of secret intelligences with modern embellishments, which in fact had an influence on military operations in the main theatres. We who were in SOE owe a profound debt to Stephenson and all those who worked in cooperation with him in so many vital aspects of inter-allied achievement. Not exactly Moonraker, but it does hint that some cool stuff happened. Even so, we still know what Stephenson did in broad strokes. We know, for example, that he established a censorship station in Bermuda with the support of his American counterpart, Bill Donovan. This had over 1,000 censors, intelligence officers, and codebreakers who worked there during the war, examining every piece of transatlantic mail for any useful or workable information. Their biggest success was busting the so-called Joe K ring, led by US-born German spy Karl Ludwig. Ludwig and his agents were sending information to Berlin about Allied ships in New York Harbour so they could be targeted by German U-boats. At various points during World War II, William Stephenson represented at whole or in part the MI5, MI6, the Special Operations Executive, the Political Intelligence Department, the Office of Naval Intelligence, the Security Council, and the Special Branch of Scotland Yard. So 7 different intelligence agencies that we know of. And in an unusual move for a spy, he received public recognition for all of his efforts, and he was knighted in 1945, as personally recommended by Winston Churchill, who wrote in his recommendation letter in part, "This one is dear to my heart." Still, very few people know the true extent of his work. The public announcement in the newspaper simply referred to Stephenson as being employed in a department of the Foreign Office. The Americans too wanted to show their appreciation for Agent Intrepid's invaluable contributions to the war effort, so they awarded Stephenson the Medal of Merit, making him one of the first foreigners to receive this particular honour. Following the war, Stephenson stepped away for some much-needed R&R and bought a little place in Jamaica. He and his wife would often host fancy dinner parties, shindigs and soirees where the guest lists were usually a who's who from the world of entertainment, politics and the media at large. This was his life for about 5 years until Stephenson got bored with his little island retreat and started lusting after the big city again. So in 1951, the Stephensons sold their house in Jamaica and moved to New York City, where they lived right above Greta Garbo in a lavish apartment that took up an entire floor of the building. As a civilian again, Stephen once again returned to the world of corporate America, but without as much aplomb as he had before. He encouraged development and investment opportunities in the Caribbean, as well as his native Canadian province of Manitoba, but he suffered a stroke in the early 60s that slowed him down considerably. After a long and grueling recovery, the Stephensons decided, screw this, and said goodbye to the business world forever, so they packed up their bags for a final time and moved to Bermuda. They spent the next decade and a half there in relative solitude, although the people who came to visit Stephenson's, the ones from his previous life as a Spymaster, all said that he stayed well informed on all significant global developments. And he still reportedly had a telex machine which he used to send and receive secret communications from all over the world well into his advanced age. Whether or not Stephenson still moonlighted as Intrepid, we can only speculate. Mary Stephenson was the first to go, dying in 1977 of cancer. Since they had no children of their own, William Stephenson adopted his late wife's nurse, Elizabeth, as his daughter. He lived for 12 more years, dying on January 31st, 1989, at the age of 92. His funeral, like his life, was furtive and hush-hush. As per Stephenson's last wishes, his death was announced only after his funeral had already taken place, thus ensuring only a handful of his closest friends and family would attend. And thus, the life of Intrepid ended. So thank you to everyone at home for tuning into this episode of Biographics. As mentioned at the start, I've been your host, Karl Smallwood. It's still my real name. You can go look her up on social media. Alongside my links, you will find links to the author of this piece, Radu Alexander, if they provided them for us, in addition to links to my other channels that I help run. Fact Fiend with Karl Smallwood, and Wiki Weekends, which I present with a good friend of mine. I don't know why I do this. This is a nervous habit. I want to stop that, because that's something I would like to ask as well. So if you like the video, leave a like. If you have any comments, you can leave them below. In particular, I'd like comments about my hosting and presentation style. I've been taking aboard all the feedback we've received so far, or at least the feedback that's not just, I'm not Simon Whistler. I can't help it. I'm not as aerodynamic or as erudite as he is, but I am trying my best. So any feedback about that will be greatly appreciated, and I am trying to improve. Like, I've got new sound equipment, new video equipment, been moving stuff around slowly and behind the scenes. Our editors, writers, and producers have all been working their asses off to try and make me sound as presentable as possible. But either way, I appreciate people sticking with us through this transitionary period. Thank you to everyone for watching. Like, comment, subscribe, as I've already said. And as always, I'd like to wish everyone has the day that they deserve. Thank you very much. Cheers.